up and running. So we're gonna get started. We're gonna get the ball rolling. What's gonna happen here today is we're actually doing the first of a series of webinars that are going to be a little bit more specialized. If you haven't done our introductory session yet, please look out for in a follow-up email an invitation to do that as well. Please understand that if you're not super familiar with Quizalize, we are going to do some introductory stuff today, but we're not going to go in as much depth as we normally would in an introductory session. This is about differentiation, and it's about our differentiation feature. But on top of that, we're really hoping to go into a lot more depth into the pedagogy, the best practices regarding differentiation, and hopefully you can kind of take that advice and roll with it and use use the features that we offer down the line. But we're hoping to really go into a lot more depth into those best practices. That's what's really important today. You can see her on video. She'll be able to introduce herself in a few moments. We have Ashley Jackson. She's from Texas in the United States, and she's been amazing, being a really great advocate of the differentiation feature that we have with Quizalize. So we'll give her a moment, a little bit in a slide or two to do a little bit of an introduction. Then we're gonna do a little bit back and forth. And hopefully you guys are excited about what we have to talk about. And of course, I wanna get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way as well. If you want to communicate with each other, please use the chat feature. We can see the chat feature. We can see the chat responses as well. But for the most part, if you have questions for either of us, please use the Q&A. So if the Q&A is for talking to me and Ashley, and the chat is for talking to each other. So if we can sort of set that as a precedent, that would be amazing. Again, welcome everyone. We have people from all over the world. It is 9 p.m. here in London. I know that we have some people in Europe that are staying up a little bit late as well. In the United States, they're just getting done with their school day. And of course, we do have some people out in the Pacific, the Asian Pacific, that are staying up a little bit late, or it's actually morning out there as well. So really excited to have everyone. Let's get started. So today, what we're going to do is, again, it's not going to be a Quizalize product tour. And I feel like it's important to mention that right ahead of time, because it is important you understand what we're trying to do here today. We have tutorials. So we're going to share those tutorials so that you can watch the tutorials, and that'll help you understand a little bit more about the mechanics of using Quizalize. But the reality is, when we do webinars, it's more important to us that we go a little bit beyond just how to use Quizalize. It's more about how does Quizalize fit into what you're trying to do in your classroom, fit into or your digital classroom or your virtual classroom or your distance learning environment. So that's what we're doing today, but specifically with differentiation. So first we'll introduce ourselves. We'll do a very quick introduction to Quizalize, and then we're going to go deep into differentiation. We'll walk through the mechanics of how to differentiate or how to use the differentiation feature in the classroom. But then on top of that, we're going to talk about some best practices, some experiences in the classroom, or experiences that are based on just what we've learned and all the people that we've talked to through our career. And of course, Q&A. Any questions you have, ask them during the session. If we'll hopefully be able to address them during the session. If not, we'll definitely address them at the end. So first, introduce myself. So I'm Chris. I actually work for Quizalize, and but I was a teacher back in the United States for over 7.5 years. I have a master's in education. For me personally, I was big into a lot of student-centered learning projects, project-based learning, flipped classroom. And so I have a lot of experience with sort of a distance learning aspect, even when it wasn't necessarily required. And so that was really important to me. But currently, I've moved to London. My partner had an opportunity through a job that she had that sent her to London for 2 years. And it was a perfect opportunity for me to step outside of the classroom for a little bit. And now I'm the customer success manager for Zish, which is a company that makes Quizalize. So, that's it for me. And I think I'm going to give Ashley an opportunity to introduce herself as well.
All right. Hey guys, my name's Ashley Jackson, and I have taught 7th and 8th grade science for 5 years between the states of Oklahoma and Texas. But I'm in the Dallas, Texas area in one of our suburbs. And as of March 2nd, so right before the U.S. went to digital or online classrooms, I moved into a new position of being a ready one-to-one instructional coach. So now I'm at a high school, and I really just work with the teachers there on, integrating technology in any way possible. So outside of that, I'm currently working on my master's degree for digital learning and leading, and I'm really excited to see kind of the in-depth things of what we can be doing with this digital learning. So I think Quizalize is a huge app that I use, and it's so great to use, especially this differentiation part. So I'm excited to talk about it.
So the link that she's put in there, we're going to share the slide deck with everyone. So you'll be able to copy and paste her links. And I know that she offers a lot of her own webinars that she does. And she has a lot of really great things that she offers. Obviously not just about, obviously not just about Quizalize. As much as I'd like everything that she did to be about Quizalize, but there's so much more that she can offer. And that's part of the reason that she's here, is that we want to have an opportunity to talk about how when you do differentiation, you can also add aspects and you can add tools that are really useful to you that you're already using. And we can talk about some of what those tools are and how they sort of facilitate what you're trying to do with your assessment within Quizalize. So that's going to be a lot of what we're going to do today. All right, so I promised a very brief introduction to Quizalize. Now, at the core, we're a formative assessment platform. And yes, you've heard of many of them. It's a very crowded space. I know you've heard of quizzes, you've heard of Kahoot, you've heard of Quizlet, you've heard of Socrative, but it's actually what I used when I was teaching. When I was teaching, I didn't even know about Quizalize because this was a few years ago and we're a little bit younger of a company. But we are a formative assessment platform. We have gamification. The gamification is possible in a distance learning environment. It would be necessary that you would share your screen in a live type of screen share environment with like Zoom, Google Meet, or something along those lines. So it is possible to do that. But in reality, the idea behind the formative assessment that we try to do is it's asynchronous at its core, which means that you assign something and students have their dashboard, and their dashboard is going to have whatever assignments that you have provided to them, and you have lots of control over how many attempts they have. They can take it at their own pace. They're not forced question to question. They're not forced to take the quiz over a certain period of time. There's a lot of control that the students have with these assessments. So depending on how that fits into your lesson planning, it's really important that you understand that our goal is to provide something that is a little bit more student-centered, as opposed to something that is completely and strictly controlled by the teacher. We pride ourselves in data. Like that's our thing. Again, I mentioned the other formative assessment platforms, and there's a lot of great things that we all offer. And in reality, when you have the opportunity to do so, you probably should rotate all the different tools that you use, because otherwise your kids are going to get bored and they're going to get a little bit jaded if you do the same thing every single day. So it's fine. Use Quizalize once or twice a week. Throw a Kahoot in there, throw quizzes in there. It's not the end of the world. We understand that variety is really important. But we also want you to know that if you're going to use Quizalize, our strength is in the data that you get from those quizzes. And it could be individual quiz data, that short-term data, which you're looking, on the screen on the right here. You can analyze the results of an individual quiz. And again, today's not, this session isn't about that data necessarily. There's the differentiation piece that we're going to go into in a minute. But there's so much more that we'd love to be able to show you about that data that you can get from those quizzes. And we will have sessions that are really going to go into all the different pieces of data that you can get. But again, they're also part of the tutorials. I've made 2 videos about the data that you get from those quizzes, not in the short term, but also the long term. And I hope that when I share those tutorials after this session, please take a look at those videos. They're no more than 3 to 5 minutes. And I think you're going to learn a lot about what's possible. But here's what we're talking about today. We're talking about differentiation. And this is sort of if there's one thing that, when I talk to people through Twitter, when I talk to influencers, when I talk to people that like to talk about Quizalize and say what's special about Quizalize, it's the differentiation piece. And I think that's why Ashley's here as well. It's actually how I found her. Like, I saw her on Twitter and she mentioned differentiation, and it was really important. It was exactly at that time that I was looking for people to help me run a differentiation webinar. So it's exactly everything's happening today, because I was like, I need teachers to help me showcase differentiation. Then I'm looking through our Twitter, and there's Ashley doing a session about differentiation. It's like, oh, well, what do you know? So that's why we're here today. And we'll go into a lot more depth. I'm not even going to touch it for a second here. We're just going to move on to the next slide, and we're going to talk about how Quizalize is going to help you differentiate what you're trying to do in your classrooms, which leads to sort of what's the really important concepts today in a distance learning environment. So before we even really actually get into the differentiation, I think it's important for us to talk about why it's important to have everything as centralized as possible. And I mean, I've spoken with so many teachers, and Ashley, you can talk about your inbox and what your inbox looks like. And everyone's getting bombarded with everyone about all the thousands and tens of thousands of tools that are available to do X, Y, and Z. And they're like, oh, if you want to be able to do this, then you should use this platform. And if you want to do this, you should use that platform. But the reality is, most of the feedback that we've gotten is that if you're not able to keep everything a bit centralized to help make it easier for your students to access whether it's an assessment or any sort of resource that you want to provide to them, and if you're not able to bring it all into a central location, then it's just not going to be utilized by the teachers, by you, and it's not going to be understood by the parents, which is actually another part that's a bit, kind of swept under the rug a bit. I think we're doing, we could be doing a better job of understanding what the parents are going through. Then, of course, the students themselves, they need to be able to access something very easily. So actually, if you wouldn't mind kind of talking about your experience and the teachers that you work with and some of the challenges that you're facing with trying to centralize everything so that it's easily accessible.
Yeah, so I think our biggest problem right now is that our students have 8 different teachers that they're getting work from. And so, when you have one teacher that's telling you, okay, we're going to go to Google Classroom, and then you're going to do this assignment in Docs, and then you're going to go and do this quizzes, and you're going to do all of these different things to make sure that you understand the material, it gets really complicated really fast. And when you have 8 different teachers telling you that, I know our kids are overwhelmed and very stressed about it. So one of my favorite features on here is that I can set up a quiz on here, and then right after it sends them the one link of what they need to do next. So it keeps it really organized and simple for students. And that one time I can make a how-to video for them, and then right away they understand how to use it.
That's actually really important. You mentioned a how-to video, and I think, as with anything new, there's a certain hump you have to get through. There's a threshold of understanding. And I guess this is an opportunity and again, this goes back to my experience doing the flipped classroom, which it's not a type of learning experience that students are used to. And anytime you change anytime something changes with your students, it's really important that you have clear expectations. Mm-hmm. So with this, and even though, again, we pride ourselves in trying to make it as simple as possible, but if they've never done it before, then the first time they do it, there's probably going to be some things that go wrong. And this is an important opportunity to say, listen, don't give a really important quiz that's graded the first time you hand something out. Like, definitely do a practice run, set up your class, invite, assign some silly quiz that doesn't really matter to your class, and just kind of let them practice accessing your quiz. We'll go through that in a second, but it is really important just with anything new, especially in an environment where you're not able to look over your students' shoulders, that you kind of take that opportunity to set those clear expectations, but also do those practice sessions. So I wanted to mention that because we're going into a situation where we're trying to have students enter a centralized LMS, probably in 99% of cases with everyone here, where, you know, every time you try to communicate with students, it's through that centralized location. So let's start there, right? If you have Google Classroom, which is actually alarmingly large number of people these days, Google Classroom seems to be one of the most popular ways for you to communicate with your students, to assign your quizzes, to assign any resource that you have. And luckily, we do have a full Google Classroom integration. So if you have Google Classroom, that's wonderful news for you. When you assign a quiz within Quizalize, it'll automatically go to your Google Classroom class, and centralizing is way easier. However, I do want to speak to everyone else as well, because you know, how do you communicate and how do you centralize things when you don't have a full integration? And the great thing about Quizalize is that, yeah, students would have to access Quizalize through a browser. They have to open a window and they'd have to go to zzzi.sh. It's a very simple HTML. And they'd have to enter a code. Okay, well, this is an example. What we're looking at here is, I used Schoology back when I was teaching, and if I were to try to direct students to Quizalize in order to take their quiz and do the follow-up activities, it's as simple as putting in the link, like zzi.sh, they click on the link and that's it. So it's a little bit of an extra step. It's not a full integration, but the good news is with a browser-based platform is that you don't have to worry about them having to download an app onto their device. You don't have to worry about them having a laptop, which is another concern that a lot of families are having, which is they might only have one computer in the household, and if there's 2 or 3 kids that they're all expected to do all sorts of different work that their teachers are trying to assign them. It's nice to know that there's at least some possibility that a student could access their activities through their phone or through anything that accesses the internet and has a browser. So just throwing in that link to the Quizalize platform, and then putting the code very clearly into those directions in the assignment or whatever post that you put on your LMS. It's as simple as that. They click on that link, they go to Quizalize, and that's it. So again, it's about keeping everything centralized. And then now that they're going to be going into Quizalize, they're going to be given a whole bunch of different options. They're going to be given their assessment. They're going to be given their follow-up activities. And everything is really easy and simple for those students. So the next important question is, why is differentiation important? So I'm going to take a moment, because it's actually really important for me to say this, because I think it's an interesting story. But differentiation is literally the reason I work for Quizalize. I was it was 2018, and we were about 2 months away from leaving New Jersey to move to London. I was in a passenger seat of my car. My mom was driving us to my sister to see her one last time, to kind of have like a little bit of a get together before I left. And I was still looking for a job. And I'm on my phone, I'm looking for jobs, and I search for ed tech companies in London, and they have this top 20 list. And of course, you see Zish and Quizalize is up there along with 19 other companies. And the first thing I saw was Quizalize does automatic differentiation. And immediately I was like when I was teaching, everyone's telling me, you got to differentiate your classroom. That's the big buzzword at the time. And, I actually had fairly small classes, and even I thought it was challenging. I think my largest class was 24 students, which is a lot, but also I know that a lot of our teachers have way more. And even that was challenging. Think about, like, how am I going to help this group of students and be able to have the mental wherewithal to give them a different set of activities, and then pay attention to what those middle kids are doing. And then what about the kids that are, they're already pretty much advanced? And as teachers, we tend to sort of fall back on the idea where it's like, oh, those kids that are already advanced, I'm going to recruit them to help me teach the kids that are struggling. And that's not right, in my opinion. But so getting an opportunity to easily give them some sort of activity that is able to stretch them, I think, is critical. Because if we're not doing that, then we're sort of holding them back. And so I think that's one of the things that's really important about differentiation. It's not about just pulling up the kids that are struggling and giving them the right resources. It's also about making sure that we're doing what we can for the students that are already somewhat advanced or wherever they are. So Ashley, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, if you'd like to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just about meeting students where their needs are and how Chris just spoke. I mean, I came from a district, well, I'm in a district where most of our classes are 30 students per class. And so getting all those students to the level they need to be at. And I think the biggest thing on top of that is, you know, not sharing what levels all students are at. So with this all being in the same platform, being able to streamline all of your differentiation activities, students don't know where their neighbors are. And, you know, all the activities don't necessarily get blown into the class. Like, you know, when I first started teaching, I would have to literally separate my groups in class, and students knew, you know, it was obvious. They knew what was going on. And I hated that feeling, but I didn't know how else to do it. I didn't. So now with these different differentiation lessons I can put in here, you know, I can pull different groups and students have no idea who I'm working with, and then they have their own activity to focus on while we're doing it. So it's just a really good tool to use, because it's one of those where not everyone, it's not broadcasted with what level you're at. And it's one of those things where, you know, some units students do awesome in, and then some units they don't do awesome. And so you're able to just figure that out quickly and know exactly where you need to be with each student.
That's actually a really good point. I think the assumption is students that are behind they tend to always be behind, and that's not necessarily the case. And so every time you do an assessment, you are able to get that real-time input or feedback about which students are where and when. And I think it's really great about breaking those misconceptions about students, because you know, when you grade things, and you grade things that are, especially when you're manually grading them, and I don't know if you're all as guilty of this as I was, but you start to grade something, and even if they didn't have their name on it, you would start to guess who it was. And you start to get these biases about your students, because you're sort of used to that feedback that you get from them. And it may not be always, it could be 9 out of 10 times you got a student that struggles on a lot of things. But when that 10 out of 10th time that they've done something really well, you tend to overlook it because you probably didn't even notice. And so an opportunity to see, when the data is sort of graded for you, and you just have to look at the raw data, and you see students placed in buckets that are different than what they were before, it kind of takes away that bias. And I think that's really important. Another thing I think is really important is that when you differentiate, it's not necessarily about placing students that are part of the same bucket together, and you can mix them up. So this is actually one of the research papers that I wrote when I was back in grad school, was what's the optimal grouping for students. But if you were to put students together for a group, to maybe they have to do a project, maybe they have to create something. You got 3 students you got to put together. Is it, you know, what's the optimal grouping? And it turns out that a lot of research was done, and that mixed grouping was one of the best ways to create a group that was able to produce the best product. And what they found was, yes, the really advanced students were really advanced, and they knew their stuff, and if they had to apply the knowledge, they were the best people to go about doing that. But even the students that maybe weren't performing as well had some input that the higher performing students never even thought of. And it kind of goes back to diversity. And you know, diversity isn't just about whatever it is you think it is. It's about diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of just about anything you can think of. And so differentiation is not just about, you know, saying, hey, you know, even though that's kind of the way our tool is built, is if you get less than 50%, you get a certain follow-up activity. There's other ways to think about how you're going to differentiate the students based on those results and that feedback. So we do have a tutorial that's going to show you the mechanics of how differentiation works within our platform. I'm going to go through it now, but I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because, again, I'd rather not show you or spend all this time showing you how to do something that we have a video that can show you later on. So I hope that you're willing to kind of bear with me just very quickly as I kind of breeze from slide to slide and talk about how it works within our platform. And if you miss something, just understand that we have the tutorial, the video that's going to show you that again, and you can watch it at your own leisure. And it is, I think it's fairly self-explanatory. It's really pretty simple flow, I think. But the way it works is, let's say you've got your quiz. You either created your own quiz or you find a quiz within our platform that you really like. And of course, I had to put a Texas quiz, and I had to put a middle school quiz because Ashley was here. But actually, I happened, and this was a complete accident because I was just looking for middle school science quizzes. And it just so happens that middle school science in Texas is probably one of the most highly tested. If you look down on the bottom left, you can see that this quiz that I found was assigned 474 times. You're not going to find a lot of quizzes like that. We hope that with more users and with more people entering the platform, creating quizzes and assigning quizzes, that there's going to be more assessments that are like that. But this is a little bit of a unique quiz, but it gives me an opportunity to show some of the really cool things that we can do. So you find your quiz, you're ready to go. You can start it as a class game or give it as homework. Really, the only difference between the two is whether or not it's assigned now or if it's assigned later. So it's just about when you decide your quiz is available. And then you're going to be brought to the assessment settings. So after you assign a quiz, like the quiz is just the content, right? It's just the questions and it's the content that you are assessing your students. Well, then we bring you to a bunch of settings that are going to allow you to decide what type of experience that's going to be with your students. So the analogy I like to use is when you create a quiz in your classroom, in your physical classroom, you create a quiz, it's a Word document in your computer, and that's the content of the quiz. When you assign the quiz, you actually hand the quiz out to your students, you decide what parameters are going to be available for that quiz. So it could be how much time they have to do it, whether or not they get to use their notes, whether or not they get to work together, or whatever other sort of settings you set up for that quiz. So that's what this does. This is the parameters that are that you assign as part of the quiz that you're giving. These three that I'm showing that are sort of blocked off by the green box, these are really important settings that you might want to think of when you're going to do differentiation. So one thing we really pride ourselves on in Quizalize is that I think we're really great about providing feedback to the students as they're taking the quiz. Obviously, when they take a quiz, if they get a question wrong, it's going to tell them they got the question wrong. Then it's going to tell them the correct answer. Well, that isn't very conducive if you're going to do differentiation and you're going to have students take the quiz a second time. If they just memorize what the correct answers are, you're not going to get a really good pulse on whether or not they've actually learned something with those follow-up activities. So here are three settings that turn off any feedback that the students would get. So allow students to see the results. We don't want that because if they see the results, they're going to know which questions they got right and wrong, and they're going to know what the correct answers are. Showing feedback and answer explanations. We turn that off as well. Showing the correct answer, obviously we want to turn that off as well. So basically we're going to turn these three settings off anytime we do differentiation. You don't have to. It's completely up to you, but this is just my recommendation. So I would recommend turning these three settings off so that when you do differentiation and they do the follow-up activity and they do the quiz again, then if they improve, you know it's because of the follow-up activity and not because they just memorized the answers from the first time. So when you get to the point where you're ready to assign follow-up activities, here's what's going to happen. It's going to be separated into three different buckets. It's if they score less than 50%, if they score between 50 and 80, or if they score above 80. Right now, those buckets are fixed, but we're exploring the possibility this summer of actually allowing users to be able to change those percentages. So for example, you might change them from 40, 60, and or 40 and 60. So anyone between below 40, between 40 and 60, and above 60, that would be a different set of buckets. Or even changing the number of buckets. So instead of having 3, you might have 2 and say, okay, everyone who gets below 50 does this, and everyone above 50 gets that. So we're exploring that. We're really excited about that possibility. We hope that we can make that happen this summer. But the way it works is you have your buckets, and you decide whether or not, or you decide what follow-up resources you want your students to complete as a result of that performance on a quiz. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more depth later on, but it's as simple as choosing a different resource based on how the students do. Which brings us to the next question is, how do you choose what those follow-up activities are? So there's a lot of different directions we can go in. I'll start with my thoughts and then I'll let Ashley chime in as well. Basically, the way that I see it is that if students get less than 50%, then it's likely that one of the things they're struggling with are some of the most basic concepts. And in many cases, the most basic concepts have something to do with either vocabulary or just terminology in general. So my feeling is that if students get less than 50%, I would choose a resource that is going to help them with that basic vocabulary. Literally, I might even just make a Quizlet set that just says, hey, you got less than 50%, here's a Quizlet set that you have to go through the terms, go through those definitions, and just make sure you understand how the terminology works, then try the quiz again. If they get between 50 and 80, then there's your middle group. That's probably the group that you're hoping everyone gets into at minimum. And maybe that's where your minimum expectations are. And so you might have a follow-up resource that you think is appropriate, where if you wanted every single one of your students to understand what was going on, that's where your follow-up resource would bring them. And then of course, at above 80%, that's your stretch resource. That's your resource where you might choose something that it's an 8th grade class. You choose something that might be technically appropriate for 9th or 10th grade or something like that. That's the way I would go for it. I think that stretching is really important in the above 80%. It's very vague. The reason Ashley's here is because I never actually got to do this in the classroom. And I'm kind of hoping that that she has a little bit more insight into how this is actually going to work in the classroom. But that's more or less how I would look at it.
So on the follow-up activities for me, I usually did, if my students performed less than 50%, I kind of needed them to just like go back and start from the beginning. So whether this was a quiz over material that they learned in a grade previously, which a lot of, being a 7th, 8th grade science teacher, we build all material from 5th grade to 8th grade to prepare for our like state test. So it's a lot of, coverage of material that we don't necessarily have time to cover in our 1 year that we have with them. So, I kind of started that Quizalize. It would be what they needed to know for the 8th grade unit, but I threw in a lot of, TEKS, our standards from previous grades. And so on there, what I would do is for my 50% or lower, I would actually put like a screencast of me going over the material that they needed to know. So for instance, if we were doing a chemistry lesson and I needed them to know how to count the number of atoms in a formula, I would actually show me like teaching, how do you do this? And it's, a video of them seeing me do it again. I make them really short so they don't get bored during it or, unfocused, but put that on there because obviously they need to go back to the very beginning. And if they see that example, then hopefully it can help them when they start taking their quiz again. My middle tier, I usually do some sort of practice where they get to do some type of actually working with the material. I really like to make my own Pear Decks at this point and put it on student paced and then put that link in for the middle tier students. And then they got to practice that material again, whether they saw the notes again, they got to draw things out, just working with the material as much as they could. And then for my 80 or higher, that's my extension group. And so sometimes I would put material on there that would go over that same thing that they got to high school, just like a higher level of it, or let them do something creative with it. Like one of my favorite things for them to do as like an extension activity was for them to create a Google Classroom header where, they got to put their own work into it, but it was about the topic that we are covering during this unit. And so they got to kind of decorate it and put it as they want. And then it was our classroom header for the week or, whatever the time being was, or create their own stickers, just anything that it was kind of that creative element. A lot of my students like to do that, and it was one of those fun digital assignments for them.
Yeah, that's, I'm actually disappointed myself for not mentioning that. Maybe it's a really great opportunity to, what was it? This is why it's been a couple of years since I was actually in the classroom. So I knew that Bloom's taxonomy was starting to lose favor, and there was maybe something else I was starting to take over. I forget what it was, but we can kind of go back to that a little bit. But it is good. Like, you have your lower level understanding, quote unquote lower level, just the ability to sort of recall information as your lower level, right? So maybe this is a great opportunity to kind of help tier students and scaffold them up to a point where they're past just recalling information, or they're past just recognizing information, and then helping them get to the point where they're ready to apply it to create something to get, in science. And it is purely coincidental that both me and Ashley are science teachers, or we're science teachers. But one of the things is that, in social studies, in English, in math, certainly, because I taught math as well, at some point you want students to manipulate information beyond what is sort of the core concepts that you're trying to teach. So anything above the 80% is a really great opportunity to give them a chance to really manipulate and apply what those concepts are like. So we actually have some questions in the Q&A. So before we move forward, I'm going to address a couple of them. Actually, some of them are to Ashley, but I'll address what Fatima said, which, she asked a question about, can Quizalize be linked with Canvas? Again, we don't have a strict integration with Canvas. If I do a really quick rewind to the Schoology part, it would look very similar with Canvas as well. So whatever your LMS is, this is likely the best practice with how you're going to communicate with your students, how they're going to access your quizzes. So again, I just use Schoology because I just went back and dug up my old Schoology account and showed it up here. But basically all you have to do is create a link, zzI.sh. When students click on that link, it's going to bring them to Quizalize. So it's not a strict integration where you just assign something in Quizalize and it shows up in Canvas. This way you just have to do it backwards. You create your Quizalize quiz, and then you create an assignment or a post within your LMS, whether it's Schoology or Canvas or what have you, and students will be able to access it very, very easily. Ashley, are you able to see Deborah's question?
Yeah. I was typing something, but like typing it for her. But on there, so she just asked, when you have the extension group doing creative activities, are they working in groups or individually? I did both. I had a number of students that really liked working by themselves, and some that obviously liked working with others. So it kind of it was based on the activity or how many students I specifically needed to like meet with and work with. But I kind of let them choose. I was fortunate enough to have a very large classroom that had a section where all of our tables were for like normal classwork, and then in the back I had lab tables. So a lot of times I was able to let my students who were working on extension activities go back to the lab tables and kind of spread out or work together. And it wasn't, I wasn't defined by like noise or anything. So when I was in class, I had that option. But I think it just kind of depends on your students, because I also had students that hated working with other people, and I wasn't going to force that on them. That's their choice, at that point. So this wasn't anything that necessarily was going to interfere with like their grades or something that we're working on, the next day. So it was kind of dependent on the activity, but I did both for sure.
When I guess I'd like to kind of follow up on that a little bit, because I honestly don't know, and I'm looking for a little bit of feedback on this. How is group work working in the distance learning environment that we have today?
I mean, I don't know. I don't have students anymore, so it's kind of hard to know firsthand. But if y'all want to pop in the chat and tell us what's going on. I mean, I know if you use Zoom as your platform for like your meets, like getting to see each other face to face and stuff, there are like breakout rooms and stuff that can happen within it. And so I think it's a little bit easier. Unfortunately, we aren't able to use Zoom. So everything we do is through Google Meet. I think that if I was having to work with different groups right now, I would create different links and send it specifically to those students. But I also know with timing going on, especially middle school and high school students, I don't think any of them are waking up until 1 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So trying to schedule times to actually meet with them, it has been, I think it's been difficult, especially on teachers. So yeah, I can see it's almost impossible to do it, and people are having difficult times. So that's kind of how I would see it as a teacher. I know my students were, yeah, no one shows up. Like my students were really used to that group setting in my class because we did small group literally almost every single day. So with that, they liked that group aspect in my room, but it just kind of depends on if they were used to it before. They may be doing well with it now, and if they weren't used to it, it may be impossible now.
Yeah, I think, I mean, LMSs have those forums. I used forums heavily when I was teaching. I use Google Docs quite often, allowing Google Docs just to be that centralized area for a group of students to communicate with one another. Those are really important. And again, it kind of goes back to when you assess and you sort of want to put students in certain buckets, not necessarily about saying, hey, I'm going to take my less than 50% kids, I'm going to have them do a certain project that's different from my kids that are above 80%. It's about saying, okay, well, I know where a lot of my students are. Let's put them together in a way that I think is most effective for them to communicate and make it as diverse as possible. But yeah, no, it's been a pretty common refrain from everyone I've spoken with, from not just in the US, but everywhere, you know, students, it's not about grades necessarily. I think it's about opportunity, their ability to be motivated. And I think a lot of it is, you know, if we can find really engaging activities, and listen, I know I'm not naive. I know assessment is not necessarily the sexiest part of getting students engaged, but if you can, actually, I'm going to show later, I think there is a little bit of a way to use assessment to do that. And I think it's through improvements. And I think that's something that, in my experience, if you can demonstrate student improvement, they actually will be engaged simply because there's proof of their learning. And they are more eager to learn than you'd be surprised. Luckily, we were science teachers, and science tends to be the one that they like to talk about over the dinner table. But there's a lot of students that are really going to be touched by the fact that you assess them, they do an activity, you assess them again, and they improve, and they really take that to heart, and that is really encouraging to them. I'll address a couple more questions. So there is a question about, can elementary schools use this too? Yes. It's completely agnostic. It really just depends on how old if those students can access a browser, they can access your LMS, and they can click on a link, bam, they're in. I will say, yes, obviously there's a certain age where it gets to the point where it becomes more challenging. I would say, based on the teachers I've spoken with, I think the threshold starts to get right around third grade. Is when it starts to get to the point where anything younger than third grade, it's a bit more difficult. Obviously, my bosses would want me to tell you everyone can use it and everyone can, but you know, it is what it is. Yeah, and there's another comment about, you know, using Google Classroom. They can share documents and use Meet to discuss and assignments. HyperDocs, I think, is also probably a really great thing that I know a lot of teachers have used. If you're not familiar with HyperDocs, I'll try to include information about that in the follow-up email, because HyperDocs is a really great opportunity to continue to add resources and provide resources to students that are really dynamic, really simple, very simple thing to do. And a lot of teachers use HyperDocs.
I think there was one more question. So Deborah said, like, how often do you use it to assess students? I can just say in my class, what I would do is I would set up one Quizalize for like each unit. And I actually used it as like my pre-assessment to see how much they knew about it. And then I would do it like maybe 2 or 3 days before their like district assessment, because we have, you know, one assessment that all the schools take. But then I could show them their growth over time and how well they did from the beginning of the unit to the end of the unit. And then I still got 3 days to work with any students that I needed to before they had to take their exam over the encompassing material.
I want to share there was a really awesome tweet that I saw, and I wish I remembered who did it so I can give him, I remember that. I can give him credit for it, but it was that assessment isn't something you do to students, and helping them understand that is, I think, really powerful. Like, it's not a punishment. Again, we're going a little bit off script, but that's fine. Like, that's kind of why we're here. That's why Ash is here, because we're here to kind of help talk about our experiences and what what we think is best and how we should approach things. But assessment is, and Ashley mentioned pre-assessment, and I think pre-assessment is criminally underutilized. When I was getting out of grad school and I was taking this assessment course, it was during my last year of grad school, and they were like, oh, you should always pre-assess your students. And I'm like, at the time, I mean, pre-assessment meant I had to print out a quiz or a test and hand it to my students before I even taught a single thing. And I had to grade it. And then I had to somehow make decisions about what that meant about my teaching. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. That sounds crazy. That's so much extra work. But now we have the ability to assess very quickly digitally. And I think now that we have that opportunity, I think we should take it. And if you have the ability not just to pre-assess, but then post-assess using the same assessment and actually track what their improvements are based on whatever middle activities you gave, whether it's digitally and automatically through our differentiation, or even if you're still back in the classroom and you do a pre-assessment, do a lesson, and then give the assessment again before they leave the classroom. There's a lot of really great opportunities to actually quantitatively show how much improvement they've made. I need to move it forward actually now. So I kind of want to bring it back to the differentiation feature, and we'll address some of the other questions as well, certainly before we leave, I promise. So we were talking about, and I guess this is why things went a little, we went a little bit off script, because we started talking about like what's an appropriate follow-up activity, and it started to get really deep into the pedagogy of what we're trying to achieve. One of the things that we do is actually we track every single follow-up activity that's used with a quiz. So again, this is a little bit of a special circumstance. If I go back here, take a look in the bottom left here. It says assigned 474 times. So this is a quiz that's used a lot. And what ends up happening is as teachers use that quiz, they assign different follow-up activities on their own. And over time, you begin to realize that there's certain activities that are more effective than others. Or even if they're less, not necessarily whether they're tracking whether they're effective, at least you're getting to see what follow-up activities other teachers are using. So we actually allow you, when you're about to choose those follow-up activities, to see what other activities have been used by other teachers. So when you click on that, right, you can see here 4 resources used by other teachers found. They scored less than 50%. The number is fairly low because as soon as one resource pops up, teachers tend to click on it. They tend to use it. And so, it's once a resource becomes recommended, teachers tend to kind of use it, and they're less likely to show, kind of give their own. But 4 different activities have been used, and we're tracking how much improvement has been made based on those follow-up activities. And so you can just kind of take a look at it. You can click on it, and then you can choose one of those. Or if you really have one that you like that that is going to be more effective, that's not listed there, then you can also add your own as well. On top of that, I will say again, that quiz itself was very highly assigned, and it's very possible you're going to find quizzes that don't have those follow-up activities that are recommended for you. But it kind of goes into a little bit of collaboration, which is if you start to use Quizalize in your classroom, at your school or your district, and we recommend sharing those quizzes with each other. Because if you share those quizzes and your colleagues are also giving the same quizzes that you are, you're more likely to see those recommended follow-up activities based on that collaboration. So you do it one year, you give a quiz, you share it with your colleagues, and they give that quiz as well. You go back the next year, next thing you know, you and your colleagues all have recommended activities, and without even actually having to talk to each other, you know which activity was most effective. So, we hope that over time that there's going to be quizzes that are really highly effective, quizzes that are given a lot. And the more that they're given and the more that you use the differentiation feature on top of that, you're going to see those recommendations more or less more often as well. So it's important before we're done today to do a quick sort of preview of what it looks like from a student perspective. And it's very simple. It's basically, if we're looking at the student dashboard, and here's the quiz that you've assigned, right? So, you know, we completely switched gears. We're suddenly music teachers, and we're giving a quiz called Music for Beginners. So when students take the quiz, they're going to finish the quiz, and they're going to, you know, assuming we've turned off all those settings that we talked about before, the feedback settings, what we're basically looking at is the student is just getting a really rough idea of how they did. Obviously, you know, we're not, you know, we don't give them a score per se. We just want to give them some stars, just give them a rough idea of how they did. And when they click save and finish, they're brought right back to the student dashboard. And if it doesn't look like it because it looks very similar, but this is actually the follow-up activity. Here's the quiz, here's their results, and here's the follow-up activity. It's a YouTube video, okay? So we've assigned a YouTube video for students that got less than 50%. They watch the video, and then they're taken back to the quiz again. So it's about assign the assessment, take the follow-up activity, go back to the assessment. If they do better, they do another follow-up activity. Okay, so they did better. They do another follow-up activity, and it's a different YouTube video. And to be fair, YouTube videos seems to be the most popular follow-up resources that teachers like to give. They're pretty low-hanging fruit, but they do tend to be effective. But there is the issue where I know that a lot of districts are blocking YouTube. Just remember that it doesn't have to be a YouTube video. It could be a web link. We talked earlier about it could be a Nearpod lesson, it could be Pear Deck, it could be something your school or district is paying for, your state or your country is paying for. It could even be a PDF, something that you can upload into the system, like a worksheet or something like that. And then, not to sort of beat a dead horse, you know, it's just back and forth, right? You take the quiz, do the follow-up activity, take the quiz, do the follow-up activity. And here's that third resource. So students that got above 80% would be given that stretch activity or that application activity, that creativity activity, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. And it's sort of all, I guess, one of the things that I wish we could patent is the whole set it and forget it thing, which is kind of the way it is, right? You set everything ahead of time, and the students are more or less directed through, and they're scaffolded up to that level of mastery that is what you're hoping to achieve. So as long as students are actually completing those follow-up activities, you can rest assured that any student that started at a lower level is going to be scaffolded up to a level of mastery that you feel more comfortable with before moving forward. I think we have a few Q&A questions. Can the students bypass a follow-up activity and simply retake the quiz? I'm actually going to go into that right now. So basically, when the students take the quiz, right, and you look at your results on your end, you can actually keep track of whether or not the students have taken that quiz. I'm sorry, have watched that follow-up activity or completed that follow-up activity. One of the things that is challenging about a browser-based system is that we can't strictly follow the students outside of the system when they take that quiz or when they do that follow-up activity. So if it's a YouTube video, we can tell you that they've started watching the YouTube video. So you can see the screen right here. We can tell you that they've started watching the YouTube video, but they have to indicate that they've done it. We can't necessarily track if they've watched up to a minute and stopped, or if they've watched up to 2 minutes and stopped. So there is a little bit of an aspect where the students have to indicate to you that they've completed the follow-up activity, and no matter what it is, right? And again, if it's a PDF, there's no possible way we could tell you how much of that PDF they've completed. So it really is up to the student to an extent to showcase how much or showcase whether or not they've completed that activity. And on top of that, just to kind of show how it's important to be able to show how much they've improved as a result of the activity, just look at their improvements, right? So when you go back to that same screen, you can see their improvements, and you can see how much they've improved over that period of time. Whether it's a whole class improvement, right? So if you find that the entire class is not improving very much overall, then that might be a little bit of an indicator of whether or not those follow-up activities are actually effective, right? That's really important, because if the entire class doesn't improve, then there's something that needs to change overall. And it's not just about what the students are doing. Again, assessment is not about doing something to the students. It's about what are we doing to understand what they understand and what we're doing to adjust, right? So we might think to ourselves, okay, this clearly didn't work. Let's do this again, right? If the class does improve, but you're able to see the individual students and they're not, and there's individual students that aren't improving, then we're opening up a little bit of a dialogue. And I think that's also what's really important about this, which is any data that you get is about understanding your students and being able to open that dialogue with your students. So if you have whole class improvement at 58%, and there's a student that's only improving 5% or isn't improving at all or even regressing, then there's an opportunity to open up a dialogue with that student. It might not even be an academic dialogue. It might actually be, okay, we're in a distance learning environment. I can see that you're not improving as much as other students. Let's kind of try to discover what's going on. And so, you know, the data that you get from formative assessment, again, it's not just about grades. It's not just about getting quantifiable information about your students. It's about understanding them and trying to understand what they're going through and what you can do to help. All right, let me check the Q&A one last time because we're towards the end here. Can you use, so we have a question here, can you use different follow-up activities each time they fail the quiz, or is it the same activity each time? So it is locked in. It is locked in based on that individual activity. If you want to reassign the quiz, and again, use this information that I'm showing you here. Use the improvements. If you find that the students that are getting less than 50% aren't improving very much, then it might be worth evaluating what that resource was and trying something else. So reassign the quiz, give different follow-up activities, and you can then see if those follow-up activities are a little bit more effective. Do we differentiate lesson initially for your special education or ESL students? Again, this is a situation where you know your students better than anyone else. So if you have special education groups, if you have ESL groups in your class, it may be that you are assigning or you're choosing activities that are appropriate for those groups. Because the follow-up activity is strictly based on those percentages, then you could extrapolate that if there's ESL students that are having difficulty understanding the basic terminology, again, it goes back to what I talked about before, they would likely benefit from something that simply helps them with the terminology, helps them with the definitions, helps them with the English that they need to learn in order to understand those concepts.
When you're setting up the questions, isn't there a record feature on there?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
You're talking about the text-to-speech?
So yeah, so it can read the questions aloud also. So that's a good option to have on there for, I know like my EL students, like they like to hear the question also, so.
Yep, that is correct. Yep, thank you. So yeah, I mean, it's a feature that you would turn on for your quiz when you create the quiz or when you assign the quiz. So we have text to speech, so that does help a lot with the ESL students. And I know that also the foreign language teachers love to use the text to speech as well. We also have the ability to you can upload an audio file so that the question isn't necessarily something that you would text, something right out. You could actually record yourself asking the question or something that you want your students to translate, and then that could be your question. So it could be you saying a sentence in Spanish, and then they can answer the question that's in English. So it is absolutely possible. So last thing I want to talk about is, okay, so what do we do with improvements data? This is actually one of my favorite pieces of data that we get from multiple attempts with Quizalize. So obviously it makes a lot of sense with differentiation because you get a sort of quantitative snapshot of how effective your follow-up activities are, not just for the whole class, but for individual students. But I know that, okay, so I'll let Ashley pop in. And I know that she's used this data as well a little bit.
Yeah, so especially now, I mean, it was one thing in class, we would talk about the data and I would show them like the most missed questions, and we would talk about why we missed those questions and go over that important information. But I think even now, as you're doing, you know, your digital classrooms, that's something you still have the opportunity to do. Pull it up in a Google Meet or Zoom meeting and be able to talk through those questions and, you know, figure out maybe what happened with each of them, or set aside time to meet with individual students and talk about, okay, well, this is what I saw over time. And, you know, you can still make that small group aspect happen digitally, just setting up different Google Meets or Zoom meetings for those students, and getting to connect with them based on their data and how they've been improving over time.
Yeah, and it goes back to sort of the importance of that individual feedback and using the data to give that feedback. A number of districts that I've spoken with are, especially for the younger grades, they're less concerned with grades and they're more concerned with feedback. And when I was teaching, we actually had to give very detailed feedback 8 times a year. And I don't mean pick a sentence and put it on the report card. Like, we had to write stuff out. And it was really difficult when you had a student that got like a B. And okay, you can explain why a student got a B the first time, but then the second quarter comes around, they got a B again, and you got to explain why they didn't improve. And it's like, I don't know. Like, it was really difficult because I just didn't have the, I didn't have the data. I had a lot of obviously tests and quizzes that I gave, but there was nothing really that was helping me understand the trends. And I think that's one of the most important things is multiple points of data gives you a lot of more information that helps you understand trends. So, you know, it's less about, okay, yes, I'm just going to somehow talk about the quizzes and summative assessments that I give to my students. But if I had obviously a tool that helped me understand a bit more about how much time they're spending on their follow-up activities, what follow-up activities were most effective to them, and if I opened up a dialogue with them as much as possible, then I have a lot more insight and a lot more ability to sort of report on what's going on. So we've gotten a lot of information from teachers that said that the improvements data and all the other quiz data helps them with parent-teacher conferences, helps them write their helps them write their reports, less about grades and more about that qualitative sort of feedback that they want to give, so that the students understand what's going on, the parents understand what's going on, and this is sort of where we get that. I think another big part of it is improvements data is good for motivation, and I think whenever you have an opportunity to show students that they've improved, either individually or as a class, and you could tie rewards to it, you know, which is often the case, especially with the younger kids, or with older kids, the rewards are sometimes, you know, maybe it's like, you know, if everyone improves 20% overall, then you guys are exempt from homework for a night or something like that. Those are usually very effective, but, you know, without those tangible rewards, there's still an opportunity to say, hey, listen, I assessed you guys at the beginning of class, you did the follow-up activities, and then I assessed you again, and you guys improved 30% as a class. Like, what you did today mattered. Like, I can prove to you that you actually learned something and it was worth it. And again, you know, they're never going to outwardly admit it necessarily, but that's highly motivating to students when you can showcase how much they've improved as a result of what you've done. And again, if they haven't improved, then again, it's another teachable moment. It's something else you can talk about. It's what's going on. It's what do we need to do to change? What do I need to motivate you guys a little bit better? What can we do to engage you a little bit more? What's going on at home? Like, there's so many questions you can ask. There's so many conversations you can have. But what direction those conversations go in is going to be highly dependent on what kind of information you actually have. So that covers it, I think. Again, I didn't want to go into a lot of the nitty gritty of the differentiation feature itself. It was really about hoping to have a dialogue about what is the purpose of differentiation. Obviously, you know, we think Quizalize is a great tool for doing that. I do apologize if you were expecting something a little bit more technical. Again, the tutorials will likely help you with that, and I'll follow up with that as well. Feel free to reach out to me, or I think Ashley would, I don't want to speak for her, but I think she would appreciate if anyone reached out to her and if they wanted a little bit more feedback as well. And then, of course, share questions and comments on Twitter. And that's where a lot of that dialogue happens. So if you're a Spanish teacher that is looking for other Spanish teachers that use the differentiation feature, I guarantee you, if you tweet about it and at Quizalize app, they're going to respond and you're going to get a lot more feedback. Get into those Facebook groups or whatever your those different communities are, and I guarantee that you get people talking about it, and you get a little bit more detailed responses and feedback that's important to you with your subject. So